December 28th, 1944. 12 days into the freezing nightmare known as the Battle of the Bulge. The war in Europe hung in a precarious, violent balance. Thousands of American soldiers were dying in the white drifts of snow at Bastogne, surrounded, battered, and running low on ammunition, far from the screaming artillery and the biting wind. Inside a warm, well-lit office in Versailles, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his mahogany desk. He was reading a memo, and as his eyes scanned the typed lines, his hands began to shake. It was not a tremor of fear. Eisenhower had faced the prospect of defeat before. He had borne the weight of D-Day on his shoulders. This was something different. This was a cold, professional rage that started in his gut and radiated out to his fingertips. The document in his hands did not come from the German High Command. It was not a threat from the enemy. It was a missive from his own subordinate, the most celebrated British soldier of the war, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. And it contained a demand so insulting, so politically explosive, that it threatened to shatter the Allied alliance right there in the middle of the war's most desperate winter. Montgomery was formally demanding that Eisenhower relieve the American commanders of the 1st and 9th Armies immediately. He wanted them fired, not for cowardice, not for losing strategic ground, not for tactical incompetence in the face of German panzers. He wanted them removed for failing to keep their men's feet dry. Consider the timing of this indictment. While the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were huddled in frozen foxholes, scraping ice from their rifles and watching their friends die from shrapnel at Bastogne, their most powerful ally sat in a heated headquarters, typing up a critique of their SOC management. To Eisenhower, this wasn't just a memo, it was a betrayal. It was a stab in the back delivered in the middle of a life-or-death struggle for the continent. Eisenhower forced himself to read the memo again, searching for a misunderstanding, hoping that perhaps the dry British wit had been lost in translation. But he hadn't misunderstood. Montgomery was making a specific, calculated argument. American generals were morally unfit to command modern armies because they lacked the competence to manage basic soldier welfare. But behind this critique of wet socks lay something far more dangerous than a debate over hygiene. Montgomery was building a legalistic case to strip the United States of command authority over its own armies. He was using the suffering of private soldiers as a lever to seize power. Montgomery's memo was clinical, detached, and dripping with contempt. He presented statistics that were admittedly horrifying. American units were suffering from trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, cold conditions at epidemic rates. The figures showed American rates were 3 times higher than those of the British forces fighting in similar sectors. There were more than 45,000 cases recorded, and the number was climbing by the hour. We are not talking about simple discomfort here. Trench foot is a gruesome, agonizing affliction. It begins with numbness, then turns to a burning pain as the blood vessels constrict and the tissue begins to die. The foot turns necrotic, black and gangrenous. It smells of rotting meat. It ends with amputation. For Montgomery, this was not just a medical statistic. It was a symbol of amateurism. It represented a 19-year-old boy from Kansas realizing he would never walk again, not because of a German bullet, but because his commander prioritized shipping artillery shells over shipping dry socks. When Montgomery viewed this carnage, he didn't just see suffering. He saw proof that the Americans were fundamentally incapable of waging professional warfare. He argued that this wasn't a supply problem, it was a leadership problem. His logic was brutal and comparative. British units, operating in the exact same freezing rain, slogging through the same mud, facing the same wind, had 1/3 the casualty rate from the cold. The evidence, in Montgomery's eyes, was damning. American soldiers were eating cold K rations for 30 days straight, despite the rations being designed for only a few days of emergency use. They were sleeping in waterlogged foxholes without rotation for weeks on end. Their socks stayed wet, rotting inside their boots. To the aristocratic, methodical mind of Field Marshal Montgomery, this proved that American generals were merely businessmen in uniforms. They were like factory managers moving resources on a spreadsheet, oblivious to the professional craft required to keep a human being alive in the mud. Montgomery believed that war was not a corporate logistics exercise. It was a discipline. It required a grip that industrial might alone could not replace. But we must look deeper into Montgomery's motivation. For him, this crisis of frozen feet was not just a tragedy to be solved. It was a golden political opportunity to be exploited. He was weaponizing an epidemic of American misery to restructure the entire Allied command hierarchy. Montgomery summarized his contempt in a way that cut deeper than any tactical criticism ever could. He viewed the Americans not as professional soldiers, but as enthusiastic amateurs. He saw them as cowboys playing at a game they didn't yet understand, throwing bodies at a problem rather than using science and discipline. While he was careful with his public statements to the press, his private diaries and secret cables to Prime Minister Winston Churchill made his feelings crystal clear. He believed the Green American Command was a liability to the professional British war effort. The memo sent to Churchill carried a clear, heavy implication. If American commanders could not handle the basic welfare of their troops, how could they be trusted with the strategic command of the war? Montgomery wanted to formalize the temporary command he held in the North during the Bulge crisis into a permanent British-led hierarchy. He wanted to be the land commander of all Allied forces. To a professional soldier like Eisenhower or Bradley, being viewed as an amateur isn't just an insult, it is a judgment that you lack the basic competence to fulfill your duty. And Montgomery was about to take this accusation directly to the highest levels of the British government. To understand Montgomery's arrogance, we must understand the system that produced him. His confidence was rooted in a British military doctrine that treated soldier survival as a science. This wasn't just about kindness, it was about mathematics. From mandated tea breaks to strict rotation schedules, the British system was designed for a nation that was simply running out of men. By 1944, the British Empire was exhausted. They had been fighting since 1939. They had bled in France, in Africa, in Italy. They did not have the bottomless well of manpower that the United States possessed. Every casualty mattered because there were no replacements left to draft. Therefore, the British enforced strict, almost draconian discipline regarding preventive care. Dry socks were not optional equipment. They were a mandatory requirement of duty. Officers inspected soldiers' feet daily, and men who failed to maintain their feet faced legitimate punishment. Officers who allowed their units to succumb to trench foot were relieved of command. This wasn't a lack of courage or aggression, it was a necessity of national survival. The British soldier was a disciplined professional in a system designed to win a long, attritional war with dwindling numbers. Montgomery looked at the American casualty rates and saw sheer, unforgivable waste. He saw a preventable casualty crisis that proper leadership could have stopped dead in its tracks. During some weeks in November 1944, American units actually suffered more non-battle casualties from trench foot than combat casualties from German fire. To Montgomery, this was insanity. It proved that American generals were butchers who didn't know how to look after their assets. Emboldened by his own logic, Montgomery sent a private letter to Churchill in early January 1945. This letter was even more direct and poisonous than his memo to Eisenhower. He argued that the welfare crisis proved his broader strategic vision was correct, and that Eisenhower's broad front strategy needed to be abandoned immediately. His solution was simple and self-serving. Give him command of all Allied forces north of the Ardennes, and more importantly, give him their supplies. Montgomery wasn't just asking to lead American men. He was asking Eisenhower to take fuel, trucks, and ammunition away from Generals Patton and Bradley to feed a British advance. He was using the argument of soldier welfare to justify starving the American offensive of the resources it needed to move. Churchill read the letter with growing alarm. The Prime Minister understood what Montgomery was really asking. Montgomery wanted to subordinate the massive American armies to British command, effectively allowing Britain to claim credit for the final victory over Germany. But Churchill, ever the politician, didn't shut it down immediately. He told Montgomery to be patient, to let events play out, hoping that perhaps the field marshal could prove his case on the battlefield. General Omar Bradley, the commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, learned about Montgomery's memo within hours. The Allied command structure leaked like a sieve, and secrets rarely stayed secret in Versailles. Bradley's reaction was immediate, visceral, and furious. He told Eisenhower he would rather resign his commission before serving one more day under Montgomery's authority. Bradley was known as the GI's general. He was a man of immense empathy, tormented by the losses his men suffered. The ghosts of the Hurtgen forest, where thousands had died in a meat grinder of his making, already haunted him. He carried the weight of every telegram sent home to a grieving mother. For Montgomery to suggest that Bradley didn't care for his men wasn't just a professional slight, it was a strike at Bradley's soul. But Bradley wasn't just angry about the criticism of welfare. He was furious about the hypocrisy. Montgomery was lecturing the Americans about soldier care while his own operations were burying British paratroopers. The man preaching about the sanctity of dry socks had just presided over one of the war's costliest and most disastrous failures. Bradley made his position absolute. If Eisenhower gave Montgomery command of American armies, Bradley would resign and he would go to the press. He would make sure every newspaper in America knew that their sons were being commanded by a British general who held them in contempt. George Patton's response to Montgomery's criticism was simpler, louder, and more brutal. When he heard of the complaints, he told his staff that Montgomery wanted American soldiers to be comfortable in their trenches, while he, Patton, wanted them home by Christmas. This highlighted the fundamental philosophical schism between the two nations. The American philosophy of war was radically different from British doctrine. American generals believed that the most humane thing a commander could do, the ultimate act of soldier welfare, was to end the war as quickly as possible. They believed that 6 months of hyper-aggressive, high-casualty operations would ultimately save more lives than 2 years of careful, methodical welfare management. Patton didn't view trench foot as acceptable, but he viewed a stationary army as something far worse. To Patton, every day a soldier sat still in a safe trench was another day a German 88mm gun could find his range. Speed wasn't just a tactic to take ground, it was a life-saving measure. This doctrine meant accepting brutal short-term hardship for long-term gain. American units pushed forward until their gas tanks were dry. They ate K-rations cold because the hot meal trucks couldn't keep up with the breakneck speed of the advance. They slept in the mud because stopping to build proper, sanitary camps meant giving the Germans 12 hours to regroup and dig in. The statistics Montgomery cited were real American units did have significantly higher trench foot rates. But what Montgomery ignored was that American units also advanced at speeds Montgomery's forces never matched. They covered ground in weeks that British operations took months to secure. Consider the breakout from Normandy. Patton's Third Army covered 400 miles in 1 month. They liberated French cities faster than the supply trucks could follow them. They reached positions the Germans thought would take the Allies months to threaten. This speed had a terrible cost. Units outran their winter clothing supplies constantly. Tanks sat idle, waiting for fuel drops. Soldiers ate whatever they could scrounge from the countryside. The staggering medical toll Montgomery fixated on was partly the result of units moving too fast to establish the infrastructure of comfort. But this speed shortened the war dramatically. Every week of rapid advance was a week the Germans couldn't use to build concrete defenses. Every breakthrough prevented the Wehrmacht from stabilizing lines that would cost thousands of lives to breach later. American intelligence officers estimated that Patton's August 1944 advance alone shortened the war by 3 to 6 months. If Montgomery's methodical, stop-for-tea and dry socks approach had been utilized across the entire front, the war would likely have extended well into 1946. We must ask the difficult questions. How many soldiers would have died in those extra months? How many more casualties would have resulted from attacking fully prepared, fortified German defenses instead of catching them in chaotic retreat? The math was brutal, but it was clear. More than 45,000 cases of trench foot versus potentially hundreds of thousands of combat deaths from a prolonged war. When you analyze the numbers, they destroy Montgomery's entire moral argument. He pointed to the trench foot casualties as proof of incompetent leadership. Those casualties were real, and yes, they were preventable with better discipline. But here is the critical context. Every single one of those soldiers recovered. Trench foot, while agonizing and debilitating, was rarely fatal in the long term. Most men returned to duty within weeks. The casualties were temporary, painful, but survivable. Montgomery was using non-fatal injuries as evidence of moral failure. Now, compare that to Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's masterpiece. This was the professionally planned operation that was supposed to end the war by Christmas 1944. It resulted in 17,000 Allied casualties in 9 days. These men were not suffering from sore feet. They were dead, captured, or permanently disabled. The 1st British Airborne Division was dropped at Arnhem with no realistic plan for relief, essentially abandoned by the planning limitations of their own high command. They held the bridge for 9 days against heavy German armor. Less than 2,000 men escaped across the river. The rest were slaughtered or marched into captivity. The division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. There is a haunting, bitter irony here that history cannot ignore. Montgomery was obsessed with the welfare of American feet, sending memos about socks and frostbite, yet he had just presided over the total destruction of the finest paratroopers Britain ever produced. The men dying at Arnhem didn't need dry socks. They needed a strategic plan that didn't abandon them to a meat grinder. Those weren't temporary casualties that could be prevented with better inspection routines. Those were men committed to an operation that, in hindsight, had almost no chance of success. Professional planning had put British paratroopers into a killing ground. Who, then, was the real butcher? The general whose men had cold feet but captured their objectives and survived? Or the general who dropped elite paratroopers into a death trap for a bridge that led nowhere? Montgomery never acknowledged this comparison. He continued to lecture Eisenhower about American welfare, while the heavy toll paid for his own flawed operations exceeded anything American forces experienced from preventable injuries. Montgomery's memo was merely the opening shot. His January 7th press conference was the final insult that nearly broke the alliance. He stood before the world's reporters and claimed, essentially, that he had saved the Americans at the Battle of the Bulge. He described finding American forces in disarray and personally organizing the defense that stopped the German offensive. He talked about his battle. He spoke of handling the armies. He did not praise the American soldier. He praised his own ability to tidy up the American mess. He was taking credit for soldiers who had fought and bled in the snow at Bastogne while he was miles away. The man who had lectured about dry socks was now stealing glory from the dead. The reaction in the American camp was explosive. Bradley, usually calm, told Eisenhower this was the final straw. Patton wanted to go to the press and tear Montgomery apart. The alliance itself was on the verge of fracturing. Churchill realized the danger immediately. He was forced to intervene, giving a speech in Parliament on January 18th that lavishly praised American sacrifice and made it explicitly clear that the Battle of the Bulge was overwhelmingly an American victory. Churchill knew that while Montgomery was a brilliant tactical mind, he was a diplomatic disaster. The Prime Minister wasn't just saving Eisenhower's feelings, he was saving Britain's future relationship with the world's new superpower. Even Montgomery's own Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Gingen, a man who loved Montgomery, had to give him an ultimatum: apologize to Eisenhower or lose your command. Montgomery was stunned. He genuinely believed he had been giving proper credit to Allied cooperation. He was so blinded by his own sense of superiority that he couldn't see how his words sounded to the men doing the dying. But the damage was done. Montgomery had lectured Americans about caring for their men while presiding over Market Garden's destruction of British paratroopers, and now he was stealing credit for American victories won in the snow. The welfare argument was dead. The only question left was whether history would vindicate Montgomery's methodical approach or the American doctrine of speed at any cost. The final verdict came from the calendar. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Military historians have since calculated what would have happened if Montgomery's methodical approach had been used instead of the American aggressive doctrine. If Allied forces had advanced at Montgomery's preferred pace, stopping to secure supply lines, building depots, and rotating troops properly to prevent trench foot, the war would have almost certainly extended into late 1945 or early 1946. Consider the consequences of that delay. The Germans would have had additional months to fortify defensive positions along the Rhine and in the Ruhr Valley. Breaking those prepared defenses would have cost tens of thousands of additional Allied casualties. Every week, the war continued meant more V-2 rockets raining down on London, killing civilians in their sleep. It meant more innocent lives lost to the horrors of the Nazi occupation across Europe. It meant more cities leveled by artillery and air power. It meant thousands more families receiving those dreaded telegrams. But there is a darker, more urgent reality that validates the American need for speed. American speed doctrine didn't just shorten the war. It determined how many people would survive to see liberation. The concentration camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were liberated in April and May 1945. Prisoners in those camps were dying by the thousands every single day from starvation, typhus, and execution. Extending the war by 6 months would have meant those camps continued operating through the summer and fall. Every day of delay was measured in human lives that could have been saved. In the spring of 1945, time was the only currency that mattered. For every day, Montgomery wanted to wait for proper supply lines to ensure dry feet. The daily toll of lives lost in the gas chambers and the barracks of the camps continued to mount. For every hour, Patton's amateurs pushed through the night without sleep, ignoring the cold and the fatigue. A few more lives were snatched back from the brink of extinction. The American doctrine of accepting short-term hardship, even the misery of trench foot to achieve rapid victory, was vindicated by this timeline. Yes, the frostbite crisis was significant. The suffering of those 45,000 men was real and tragic. But hundreds of thousands of soldiers came home alive in May 1945, instead of dying in battles that never had to be fought because the enemy collapsed under the pressure of speed. Montgomery's welfare doctrine would have kept British soldiers more comfortable in the short term, but it would have got far more men killed in the long term by extending the duration of the conflict. Montgomery prioritized a methodical, textbook advance, where everything was in its right place. He believed professional SOC management was a pillar of strategy. But history shows that professional SOC management was not more important than strategic speed. The most devastating verdict came from the German generals themselves. Interviewed after the war, commanders like Field Marshal Model and von Rundstedt confirmed that American operational tempo was the primary factor that defeated them. They stated that the constant pressure prevented them from establishing defensive lines. Every time they tried to dig in, American forces were already pushing past their flanks. They were often baffled by Montgomery's methodical pace, which gave them precious time to regroup and prepare defenses that subsequently cost thousands of British lives to break. The clash between Eisenhower and Montgomery was more than a personality conflict. It was a clash of philosophies. One prioritized the comfort and maintenance of the army. The other prioritized the destruction of the enemy. If you ask a veteran of the Ardennes what mattered more, a hot meal in a dry trench or a ride home on a victory ship in May, the answer is obvious. Montgomery prioritized a war of methodical safety. The Americans prioritized a war of strategic speed. And while trench foot is a terrible injury, it is not a gravestone. History doesn't remember who had the driest socks. It remembers who ended the nightmare.